In 1917, a single year, Russia's absolute monarchy collapsed twice over. First a revolution in February that ended 300 years of Romanov rule, then a second revolution in October that put a small, disciplined party of communists in charge of the largest country on earth. What followed was not the workers' paradise anyone had promised. Within 2 decades, thanks substantially to the man who inherited that revolution, millions of Russians would die in an engineered famine, millions more would vanish into labor camps, and history's largest one-party terror machine would turn on the very revolutionaries who built it. This video covers the whole arc every exam board sets. Why the Tsar actually fell, how the Bolsheviks actually seized power, how Stalin actually beat far more popular rivals to the top, and exactly what his USSR actually cost. Let's start with the empire that made revolution nearly inevitable. Tsar Nicholas II ruled Russia as an autocrat, an absolute monarch answerable to nobody, presiding over a vast, overwhelmingly peasant country with almost no political voice for ordinary people whatsoever. Industrial workers in cities like Petrograd endured brutal working hours and severe food shortages, while peasants in the countryside remained desperately poor decades after serfdom's formal abolition. The First World War from 1914 turned chronic discontent into genuine, mass crisis. Russia suffered catastrophic military casualties, and in 1915 Nicholas personally took direct command of the army, which meant every subsequent defeat now attached directly, personally to him. Back home, his German-born wife Alexandra grew deeply unpopular, especially through her reliance on the controversial mystic Rasputin. By early 1917, bread was scarce, factories were failing, and soldiers were increasingly unwilling to fire on their own hungry, desperate countrymen. The empire was, in every meaningful sense, already collapsing before a single revolutionary had to lift a finger. In late February by Russia's old calendar, early March by ours, bread shortages in Petrograd triggered mass demonstrations that spiraled with startling speed into a genuine, full-scale revolution. Crucially, when the Tsar ordered his troops to fire on the crowds, many soldiers refused outright, and entire garrisons mutinied and joined the protesters in the streets instead. Within days, Nicholas found he had lost the one thing every autocrat absolutely requires: reliable, obedient armed force. On the 2nd of March 1917, facing total collapse of his own authority, Nicholas abdicated the throne, ending 304 years of continuous Romanov rule almost immediately. Remarkably, this first revolution happened with comparatively little organized revolutionary planning behind it at all. It was substantially a spontaneous popular uprising, driven by hunger and sheer exhaustion, that succeeded far faster than almost anyone genuinely expected. What replaced the Tsar, though, would prove nowhere near as stable or as swiftly decisive as his sudden fall had been. After the Tsar's abdication, a provisional government formed from members of the old parliament, the Duma, promising eventual democratic elections and, fatally, choosing to keep Russia fighting in the First World War. But it never held power alone. Alongside it, workers' and soldiers' councils, known as Soviets, especially the powerful Petrograd Soviet, commanded genuine, direct loyalty from ordinary soldiers and factory workers, creating what historians call dual power. The Provisional Government's single greatest, most consequential mistake was continuing and deeply unpopular war that millions of ordinary Russians desperately wanted to see ended immediately. Continued military defeats, continued food shortages, and continued mass casualties steadily drained away what little public support the new government had started out with. Into this specific vacuum, a radical socialist party promising immediate peace, land redistribution to the peasants, and full workers' control stepped forward with a message that was, by comparison, disarmingly, dangerously simple and direct. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the radical Bolshevik faction of Russian socialists, had spent years in exile in Switzerland. In April 1917, Germany, then still at war with Russia, arranged safe passage for Lenin back home in a sealed railway carriage, correctly calculating that his return would further destabilize Russia's continued war effort against them. It was, quite genuinely, one of history's most consequential single-train journeys. On arrival, Lenin immediately issued his April theses, rejecting any cooperation whatsoever with the Provisional Government and demanding an immediate, unconditional end to the war, full transfer of land to the peasants, and all power to the Soviets. Many fellow socialists at the time considered his demands recklessly, dangerously extreme. But as the Provisional Government's own popular support collapsed further across the following months, Lenin's simple, uncompromising slogans, peace, land, and bread, began to resonate powerfully with increasingly desperate, exhausted ordinary Russians who had genuinely run out of patience with half measures. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks had won growing majorities within the key Soviets, particularly in Petrograd, where Leon Trotsky, an outstanding organizer, now chaired the Soviet directly. On the night of the 24th and 25th of October by the old calendar, 7th and 8th of November by ours, Bolshevik Red Guards seized key locations across Petrograd, the telegraph office, the bridges, the railway stations, and finally the Winter Palace itself, meeting remarkably little organized armed resistance in the process. Unlike February's spontaneous popular uprising, October was a carefully, deliberately planned seizure of state power by a small, tightly disciplined revolutionary party, executed with real precision. The Provisional Government simply collapsed, and Lenin announced the formation of a new Soviet government the very next day. A single party, representing a genuine minority of Russia's overwhelmingly peasant population, had just seized direct control of the largest country on the entire planet in barely a single night. Having seized power, the Bolsheviks moved rapidly and often ruthlessly to consolidate direct control over the entire country. Elections for a constituent assembly, genuinely promised by Lenin himself, went ahead in November 1917, but the Bolsheviks won only a clear minority of the actual seats. Lenin's response was blunt and decisive. The assembly convened for a single day in January 1918 and was then simply, forcibly dissolved by armed Bolshevik guards. In December 1917, the secret police, the Cheka, was established specifically to identify and ruthlessly suppress political opposition of any kind. And in March 1918, desperate to exit the ruinous war entirely, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering enormous, valuable territories, including Ukraine, purely to secure peace and by his fragile new government some genuinely desperate breathing room. Democracy, land, and peace had all been promised. What actually rapidly emerged in their place was a one-party state, willing to use real, direct force to hold onto power at any cost. Opposition to Bolshevik rule quickly coalesced into the White Armies, an uneasy, often deeply divided coalition of monarchists, moderate socialists, and foreign-backed military forces, sparking a brutal, genuinely devastating civil war that raged from 1918 to 1921. Trotsky, appointed Commissar for War, built the Red Army essentially from scratch into an effective fighting force through strict discipline and ruthless, uncompromising organization. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, actively intervened militarily on the White side, though their combined support ultimately proved inconsistent and genuinely insufficient to turn the wider military tide. The Bolsheviks held the crucial advantage of controlling Russia's central industrial heartland and its core rail networks, while the divided Whites never managed to coordinate their scattered, geographically separated forces effectively. Millions died from direct combat, from disease, and from outright, widespread famine. By 1921, the exhausted Red Army had decisively won, but the country it now firmly controlled lay utterly, comprehensively devastated. To keep the Red Army fed and equipped throughout the Civil War, the Bolsheviks imposed a harsh economic policy known as war communism, forced grain requisitioning from peasants, the outright nationalization of industry, and the effective abolition of private trade across the entire economy. Soldiers and Communist Party officials seized peasant grain, frequently by direct armed force, leaving many rural families with genuinely, dangerously little food left over for themselves. Industrial production collapsed dramatically as skilled workers fled the starving cities in search of food, and a severe, widespread famine struck the Volga region specifically in 1921, killing an estimated 5 million people in that single catastrophic episode alone. War communism had helped the Bolsheviks win their civil war, but it had also devastated the wider economy and generated real, growing, dangerous resentment among precisely the peasants and workers the revolution had originally, sincerely claimed to represent and speak for. In March 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, who had been among the Bolsheviks' own most loyal, most committed early supporters back in 1917, rose up in open rebellion, demanding free elections, genuine freedom of speech, and a definitive end to forced grain requisitioning. This was, for Lenin, a uniquely alarming warning sign, not disgruntled monarchists or exiled aristocrats, but the revolution's own former sailors, openly turning against it in disgust. Trotsky ordered some 60,000 Red Army troops to cross the ice and crush the uprising by direct force, and the rebellion was brutally suppressed within roughly 2 weeks, at real, significant human cost. Lenin himself later called the episode the flash that lit up reality, a blunt, honest acknowledgement that war communism had become genuinely unsustainable, even among the regime's own most committed, loyal supporters. The Kronstadt Rebellion immediately triggered one of Lenin's most significant policy reversals of his entire time in power. In direct response to Kronstadt and the wider, deepening economic collapse, Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921, a genuinely striking, pragmatic retreat from strict communist economic principles. Peasants could now sell their surplus grain for profit once they had paid a fixed tax to the state, small businesses were permitted to operate again, and limited private trade quietly returned to Soviet cities for the first time since the revolution. Lenin openly, bluntly described it as one step back to take 2 steps forward, a deliberately temporary compromise, not any kind of permanent ideological retreat from communism itself. The results were genuinely striking. Agricultural production rose by roughly 40%, and the wider Soviet economy meaningfully began to recover. But many committed, hardline communists viewed the NEP as an uncomfortable, even shameful betrayal of true revolutionary principle, a tension that would resurface with real force once a new leader eventually took over from Lenin himself. Lenin suffered a serious stroke in 1922 and a further, more severe one in 1923, leaving him largely incapacitated for his final months before he died in January 1924. Shortly before his death, Lenin dictated what later became known as his testament, a private, candid assessment of the Communist Party's senior leadership, and it contained a genuinely striking, specific warning about Joseph Stalin, then serving as the party's general secretary. Stalin, Lenin wrote, had accumulated dangerously excessive personal power and should very likely be removed from that specific position entirely. The testament was for genuinely complicated internal political reasons, largely suppressed and simply not acted upon after Lenin's death. Stalin himself helped orchestrate an elaborate, deliberately grand public funeral and immediately began actively promoting a personal, carefully constructed image as Lenin's true, rightful ideological heir. The single clearest, most explicit warning anyone might ever have received about Stalin's future direction had been calmly, quietly set aside, and it would prove catastrophically, tragically costly. Following Lenin's death, a genuine power struggle unfolded among the Communist Party's senior leadership, and Leon Trotsky, the Red Army's brilliant, celebrated Civil War organizer, seemed to most outside observers at the time the obvious, natural successor. Stalin, by comparison, seemed considerably less impressive on the surface, a capable administrator rather than any kind of brilliant orator or original theorist. But Stalin held one genuinely crucial, frequently underestimated advantage. His role as general secretary gave him direct, granular control over Communist Party membership and appointments right across the entire country. He used this specific position with real patience and considerable skill, systematically placing loyal supporters into key positions while quietly, steadily isolating and outmaneuvering his more obviously talented rivals one by one. Stalin also formed a temporary, tactical alliance with 2 other senior leaders, Zinoviev and Kamenev, specifically to isolate and defeat Trotsky first, fully intending to turn on his own temporary allies immediately afterward, once Trotsky himself had already been safely, comprehensively dealt with. Trotsky was progressively, steadily isolated across the mid-1920s, removed from his powerful position as Commissar for War in 1925, expelled from the Communist Party's ruling Politburo in 1926, and expelled from the party entirely by 1927. Stalin then turned, exactly as planned, on his own temporary allies Zinoviev and Kamenev, using essentially the very same patient, methodical tactics that had already worked so effectively against Trotsky himself. By 1928, Stalin had systematically eliminated or thoroughly sidelined every single serious rival for supreme leadership, becoming the Soviet Union's unquestioned, singular dictator in all but any remaining formal title. His path to total, undisputed power had relied far less on genuine charisma or popularity than on patient, methodical bureaucratic maneuvering, playing rivals off cleverly against one another, and firm, total control over party appointments and membership. It is a genuinely crucial exam point. Stalin won largely through institutional control, not through any inherent, particular personal popularity among ordinary Soviet citizens. Stalin's rise wasn't purely tactical maneuvering. He also won a genuine, substantive ideological argument that mattered enormously to ordinary party members at the time. Trotsky championed permanent revolution, the core belief that socialism in Russia alone could not realistically survive without further, additional revolutions actively spreading successfully to other major industrialist countries. Stalin instead promoted socialism in one country, the more practical, more immediately reassuring argument that the Soviet Union could, and genuinely should, build a fully successful socialist society entirely on its own, without waiting indefinitely for revolutions elsewhere that might realistically never actually come. This position appealed powerfully to a genuinely exhausted country after years of continuous war, revolution, and brutal civil conflict, and it also, conveniently, painted Trotsky as recklessly prioritizing risky foreign revolutionary adventures over Russia's own pressing, immediate domestic needs. The specific ideological argument and the cold tactical maneuvering reinforced each other perfectly, and together, combined, they proved genuinely unstoppable in practice. Trotsky was exiled internally to Alma-Ata in Soviet Central Asia in 1928, and then expelled from the Soviet Union entirely the following year, eventually settling, after years of restless wandering, in Mexico. From exile, he continued writing prolifically, sharply criticizing Stalin's regime as a betrayal of genuine, original revolutionary principle. Stalin, though, was never remotely content to simply let a determined rival criticize him safely from a comfortable distance. On the 20th of August 1940, a Soviet secret police agent named Ramon Mercator, posing carefully as a sympathetic supporter, attacked Trotsky in his own study with a mountaineering ice axe. Trotsky died from his injuries the following day. Stalin's Soviet government publicly, officially denied any direct involvement whatsoever, though Mercator was later secretly, quietly awarded the Order of Lenin for the killing. Trotsky's brutal, elaborately staged assassination brought a definitive, final end to Stalin's very last credible political rival, more than a full decade after he had already comprehensively lost the original power struggle itself. In 1928, Stalin abandoned Lenin's more pragmatic new economic policy entirely, launching the first of several ambitious five-year plans specifically designed to transform the Soviet Union from a predominantly agricultural country into a major modern industrial power, with real urgency and remarkable speed. Centralized state planning set genuinely extreme, deliberately ambitious production targets for coal, steel, and heavy machinery, and new industrial cities were built essentially from nothing, in some documented cases within literally just a few short years. Soviet propaganda enthusiastically celebrated so-called shock workers, ordinary laborers who dramatically, publicly exceeded their assigned production quotas, most famously the coal miner Alexei Stakhanov, whose own name eventually gave rise to an entire, officially encouraged workplace movement. Industrial output did genuinely, measurably grow at a remarkable, historically unprecedented pace. But the plans were enforced with real, often brutal ruthlessness, and the exam-relevant human cost of this breakneck industrial transformation becomes fully, unmistakably clear in the next beat, on the Soviet countryside specifically. Alongside rapid industrialization, Stalin launched the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture, ordering millions of individual peasant farms to be merged into large, state-controlled collective farms, intended to feed the country's rapidly growing new industrial cities far more efficiently. Peasants who actively resisted, particularly wealthier farmers labeled kulaks, a deliberately vague, endlessly flexible term that could realistically be applied to almost anyone showing any resistance at all, faced brutal, sweeping repression, Mass deportation to remote regions, confiscation of literally all their property, and in a great many documented cases, straightforward execution. Many desperate peasants, in furious protest, chose to slaughter their own livestock rather than simply hand it over to the new state-run collective farms, causing a further, entirely avoidable, catastrophic collapse in the country's overall food production at precisely the worst possible moment. Collectivization was meant to modernize Soviet farming rapidly and efficiently. In practice, it instead triggered one of the single worst avoidable human catastrophes of the entire 20th century. Collectivization's direct, immediate consequence was mass, widespread famine, striking hardest across Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and Kazakhstan between roughly 1931 and 1933. Historians' estimates vary considerably, but a genuinely credible range suggests somewhere between 5 and 7 million people died directly from starvation and related disease during this specific catastrophic period. In Ukraine specifically, the famine is widely known today as the Holodomor, and many historians now argue persuasively that Stalin's government deliberately, knowingly worsened it there through continued, punitive grain requisitioning and confiscation, even as people were already visibly starving to death in enormous numbers all around them. Remarkably, and quite deliberately, the Soviet Union continued exporting substantial grain abroad throughout the very worst months of the famine, specifically to fund its own ongoing industrialization drive with hard foreign currency. The state suppressed genuine, honest information about the famine's true scale for decades afterward. It stands as one of history's starkest, most brutal illustrations of a government's own stated economic priorities being placed, quite explicitly, directly above its own citizens' basic survival. The Gulag was the Soviet Union's sprawling, ever-expanding network of forced labor camps scattered across some of the most remote, most brutally hostile regions of the entire country, from the Arctic Circle to Siberia and beyond. Prisoners included so-called kulaks swept up during collectivization, political opponents of every conceivable kind, and, as you're about to see, an ever-growing number of ordinary, entirely innocent citizens caught up indiscriminately in Stalin's Great Terror. Conditions were consistently brutal: starvation-level rations, genuinely extreme cold, and grueling, physically punishing forced labor on major infrastructure projects including canals, railways, and remote mines. Historians estimate that more than 20 million people passed through the Gulag system across the whole Stalin era, and a substantial proportion, plausibly close to half by some credible estimates, never survived to be released at all. The Gulag functioned simultaneously as a genuine source of cheap, essentially disposable forced labor for the state's ambitious economy, and as a deliberately visible, chilling warning to absolutely everyone else about the real, severe cost of any dissent whatsoever. In December 1934, the assassination of senior communist official Sergei Kirov, quite possibly ordered by Stalin himself, though this remains genuinely disputed among historians, gave Stalin a convenient, ready-made pretext to launch the Great Terror, also widely known as the Great Purge, across 1936 to 1938. Show trials, publicly staged with forced, scripted confessions, targeted senior old Bolsheviks, including Kamenev and Zinoviev, Stalin's own former temporary allies, and eventually reached even the Red Army's own senior officer corps. The scale was genuinely, almost unimaginably vast. Historians estimate roughly 7 to 8 million people were arrested, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million were formally executed, and countless others died directly inside the Gulag system as a direct, immediate result. Nobody, in practice, was ever truly safe. Loyal party members, celebrated Red Army generals, ordinary factory workers could all be denounced, often on the flimsiest imaginable evidence, or sometimes genuinely none at all. The revolution had turned, with real, brutal thoroughness, on its own creators. Alongside outright terror, Stalin carefully, deliberately built a genuine cult of personality, an enormous, sustained propaganda effort actively designed to present him publicly as a wise, heroic, almost fatherly figure, personally responsible for absolutely every one of the Soviet Union's genuine achievements. His portrait hung in workplaces, schools, and ordinary homes right across the entire country. Statues of him appeared in seemingly every major town and city, and state-controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, and cinema newsreels all relentlessly reinforced the very same carefully constructed, unwavering image. Soviet history itself was actively, systematically rewritten to steadily inflate Stalin's own personal role in the original 1917 revolution, while simultaneously, quietly minimizing or erasing entirely the contributions of rivals, Trotsky most conspicuously and obviously of all. The cult served a genuinely direct, practical political function. It made any criticism of Stalin personally feel, to ordinary citizens, not merely politically risky, but something close to actively unpatriotic, even outright blasphemous, making the entire system of pervasive fear feel, to many, disturbingly natural and normal. Rapid industrialization fundamentally transformed daily working life for millions of ordinary Soviet citizens, women very much included. The number of women formally counted as workers or salaried employees rose dramatically, from roughly 2.8 million in 1928 to well over 13 million by 1939, as women entered factories, mines, and a wide range of newly created professional and technical roles in genuinely large numbers. Official state propaganda proudly celebrated this striking transformation as concrete proof of genuine socialist equality being actively delivered in practice. The reality, though, was considerably more complicated and demanding. Women were still expected to manage the great majority of housework and childcare responsibilities entirely on top of their new full-time paid jobs, creating what historians now commonly call a genuine double burden. Women were also typically paid noticeably less than men for broadly comparable work, and continued to face real, persistent discrimination in numerous workplaces despite the state's own official, loudly proclaimed rhetoric of complete equality. Progress and real, continued, structural inequality running directly alongside each other, at the very same time. The Soviet state also fundamentally transformed education and everyday social life across this same period. Mass literacy campaigns achieved genuinely remarkable, measurable success. Adult literacy rates rose dramatically across the 1920s and 1930s, opening up real new opportunities for millions of previously illiterate ordinary citizens across the whole country. But education was never remotely neutral. Schools taught rigid communist ideology alongside basic reading and mathematics, and youth organizations, the Young Pioneers for Children, the Komsomol for older teenagers and young adults, actively worked to raise an entire new generation of genuinely loyal, ideologically committed communists from earliest possible childhood onward. The Communist Party, being formally, officially atheist, actively suppressed organized religion throughout this same period. Churches were closed down or deliberately repurposed, clergy were frequently arrested or worse, and religious worship, while never technically, formally illegal outright, became a genuinely dangerous, quietly discouraged activity in practice. Real, measurable educational progress, delivered specifically, deliberately in service of tight, comprehensive, top-down state control over what people could actually think and believe. In 1936, at the very height of the escalating Great Terror, Stalin's government proudly proclaimed a brand new Soviet constitution, one Stalin himself publicly, confidently described as the most genuinely democratic constitution anywhere in the entire world. On paper, it guaranteed an impressively long list of rights: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religious worship, and universal, equal suffrage for absolutely every adult citizen. In grim, unmistakable practice, none of these formal, written guarantees meant remotely anything at all in real, lived experience. The very same year the Constitution was solemnly adopted, show trials, mass arrests, and summary executions were actively, simultaneously accelerating at real, terrifying scale right across the entire country. The 1936 Constitution is a genuinely essential exam case study in the enormous, often devastating gap that can exist between a government's formal, official promises on paper and its own actual, lived practice on the ground, and it's exactly the kind of concrete, memorable specific detail that separates a genuinely strong exam answer from merely a vague, generic one. So, pulling this whole arc together for the exam hall, by 1941, Stalin had genuinely, measurably transformed the Soviet Union from a largely backward, overwhelmingly agricultural country into a major, credible industrial power, with real heavy industry, a substantially more literate population, and a military machine soon to prove genuinely decisive in defeating Nazi Germany. That achievement was real, and the exam rewards you for acknowledging it plainly, honestly, without hedging. But it came at a cost that is equally real, equally undeniable, and arguably every bit as historically significant. Millions dead from an engineered, entirely avoidable famine, millions more worked to death or simply executed across the Gulag system, and a great terror that consumed even the Communist Party's own most loyal, most committed members without any real distinction or mercy whatsoever. Genuine, measurable modernization and genuinely staggering human cost are not separate, competing stories here running in parallel. They are, in truth, the very same single story, examined from two entirely different, equally necessary angles. That is Russia and the Soviet Union, the whole 1917 to 1941 arc every exam board expects you to know. An autocratic empire collapsing under the weight of war and hunger, a small disciplined party seizing power in a near-bloodless coup, a brutal civil war, a pragmatic economic retreat under Lenin, and then Stalin's patient, methodical climb to absolute power, followed by an industrial transformation genuinely built on engineered famine, forced labor, and a terror machine that ultimately consumed its own original revolutionaries. If you remember one single framework walking into that exam hall, remember this. Never simply describe what Lenin or Stalin did without also explaining exactly why it worked, or exactly who paid the real price for it. Genuine ideology, cold tactical calculation, and sheer, brutal coercive force were operating together at every single stage of this story, and naming all three, together in the same answer, is precisely what separates a top-band response from an average one. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist. Subscribe and good luck in that exam hall.